Thank you. I think that is the core issue in the bilateral relationship. I referred in my opening remarks to the fact that the United States was having difficulty adjusting to the need for a new equilibrium in East Asia. And I think that's a real problem for us, because if you read American speeches and writings on the subject, we still have many people who think that dominance in air and naval power, for example, is necessary for the United States. And you can't have a new equilibrium if either China or the United States are setting dominance as a goal, because the other side will not accept it. And therefore, if we're going to have a dialogue with China, we have to begin addressing the question of how do we strike a military balance in which each country feels it can meet its defense needs, and the United States, that includes the defense needs of our allies, but is not so powerful that we appear to have the capability to engage in aggression against the other side. And we are not yet there, and we are not yet mentally prepared to try to undertake that task. And it is absolutely necessary, because you have to have a balance of power in East Asia. And otherwise, we're going to be continually in strategic rivalry with each other. And that's one reason why I think it is absolutely wrong to think that our dominant factor has to be strategic rivalry. Because strategic rivalry always focuses on the military component, and that ends up generating an endless arms race in which resources are diverted away from economic development into military development. Now here, I think the United States has to stop thinking in terms of dominance. And I think the Biden administration was wrong by introducing this concept of dealing with China from a position of strength. Anybody would understand that China would never accept that as a basis for the United States to deal with China. And the same term cropped up during the Cold War when I worked on Soviet affairs. The Soviets were very sensitive to the idea of the United States dealing with them from a position of strength. But China is making an enormous mistake by not defining its defense needs strictly in terms of China's defense requirements. But now China has linked its defense needs to its international status as a great power. At the 18th Party Congress in 2012, the first part of the military portion of the work report talked about China needing a powerful military commensurate with its international standing and appropriate for its defense and development needs. And at the 19th Party Congress, China talks about requiring a world-class military power. Well, if China has a world-class military power when it has no global military responsibilities, China has no allies outside of the, beyond its immediate periphery, in which it has to size its military to meet those requirements. So when Americans look at China, we don't see any ceiling on terms of where China wants to develop its military power. And in my opinion, China has to rethink how it is talking about its military requirements. Because if every country tries to develop military capables in terms of their international status, what size military does Japan need? What size military does India need, et cetera? It's the wrong way of looking at the issue. Military requirements should be linked to your defense requirements, and the United States and China need to be thinking in terms of, as President Xi himself has said, a Pacific in which China and the United States can both function together. He said the Pacific is large enough for both China and the United States. And Xi Jinping, in his earlier speeches, has specifically referred to the defense dilemma, which is if China has absolute security, its neighbors have no security. And he's used that exact language in his speeches. So he understands the issue that there has to be a limit on China's defense capabilities, or its neighbors will all lack security. And this is an area where the United States and China, sooner or later, and the sooner the better, need to start engaging in a dialogue to see if there is a possibility for a strategic equilibrium in East Asia that is compatible with the national interests of both sides. And that means that our national interests also have to be defined in a way that doesn't exclude that possibility. So I think there is enormous scope for China and the United States to stop looking at the world in terms of their own domestic driving factors and to understand that they have to look at the external circumstances in the world in an objective way and then formulate foreign policies that are compatible with the international circumstances in which they have to operate and gain the domestic support for that approach. The United States is not yet doing that. For example, if we look at East Asia, where all of the countries of East Asia have more trade with China than with the United States, it is clear that if we ask Asian countries to choose between China and the United States, they are not going to want to do so because they have very important interests with China. And so we have to understand that. And our foreign policy approach to China and the way we talk about China must not be put in ways that require countries to choose between the good United States with our democratic system and the bad China with its authoritarian system. That's the wrong way to formulate our foreign policy concepts. And China, as I've already illustrated, in my judgment, is making the same mistakes. It's talking about needing global military power because of its status as a great power. And when China, going back to the 19th century, talked about the need for China to regain wealth and power, the power would no longer be the subject of aggression by stronger countries. It was a defensive concept, not an aggressive concept. And that has been lost now because China is talking about powerful military are needed because of its international standing. So this is an area where I think both of our countries need to do a lot more serious thinking.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Raw. I think you illustrated quite well. I think both countries should not really using ideology or the old mentality to measure the 21st century reality. So absolutely. That we need a new thinking, a new narrative for that. I think you're probably I think right in terms of talking that we should not really dominant, seeking dominance on each other. That's absolutely correct. And China has really also said in many times that historically China never colonized any place or sent a soldier anywhere. So what actually China is, in our observation, is that when they build up some military, it seems to be the defensive purpose. I mean, you see there's lots of exercise along South China Sea or Taiwan Strait, and China really probably catch up and defend that. But one fact is that the U.S. military budget is equal to the next 10 countries combined, whereas China building the speed railway, total length of that is equal to the next country combined. So, but your idea is well taken. I think that we should really seek in the peace and understanding. And so I think we really need a lot of dialogue on that. I agree with you. We need more exchanges and talking through those issues, and let's get out of the suspicions and mistrust. Now, Minister Zhu, I want to turn to you now. I remember 2016 when we had 100 G20. You were still the coordinator for the G20 on the Minister of Finance, you were actually saying that the BIT almost closed between China and the US. So I was watching you at CCTV, and you've been taking an interview along the West Lake in Hangzhou. But again, another story I heard from you is that when the 2008 financial crisis happened, you got a call from the US Treasury Office and talking about how about China and US working together to really fight in this financial crisis. China really immediately launched the 4 trillion RMB revival plan and things like that. You know, US China really worked together to get the crisis passed. So what do you think about current crisis of pandemic, how we can really work together? I mean, you had a lot of experience on that in working with US. Maybe your view on that as well. Minister Zhu, you have to open your mic. Microphone, yes.
Before answer your question, I just want some response to Ambassador Roy's the idea regarding the military strategy and the military intention. And to be honest, in the modern history, China suffered a lot of invasion from foreign countries, and the Chinese people very deeply understand that's how suffered by outside press, and that's I think that's the people's willing China become very strong country, and however for strategy and the real situation, when China talk about our core interests, that's 3 points. Number 1, sovereignty. Number 2, territory integration. And number 3 is developing right. And we hope with that, China can really become the modernized socialist country and with united country, and with the country can benefit the people's living standard. I think for those one, we can have very frank communication to deepening understanding. So I think that's between China and the US to really understand each other's intention become very important, particularly at this time. Now, question about Huiyao you raised regarding this 2016 G20 meeting and the BIT between China and the US. Yes, that's indeed. That's under strong leadership by President Xi Jinping and President Obama. Before G20 Hangzhou summit, Chinese team and the US team worked very, very hard. And that time, US team, the leader is Mike Furman, the trade representative. He did a lot of work, keep the very close communication with the China team, with Chinese team, nearly every day, and maybe one day 3 or 4 times, and both on very hard work with strong leadership by 2 presidents. Yes, indeed, that's we can say openly that time to the Chinese media and the foreign media, the treaty between China, US on BIT, the nearly complete 90%. And we also understand some key challenge, digital economy, particularly data privacy, data cross-board moving. And we just want more hard work can follow. Unfortunately, after that, everybody knows that U.S. administration change and even the abundance of TPP. So that's delay the continue negotiation. And another case, indeed, that's in 2008. That's I remember that's October of 2008. That's the international financial crisis. I really, in the very early morning, 3 a.m., received the phone call from my counterpart in U.S. Treasury. She want immediately around the meeting between Secretary Treasury Wang Posen with his Chinese counterpart to talk about possible upgrade G20 format from finance minister and the central bank governor to the leaders. Yes, we did that after 3-4 hours. I think that's 10 a.m. Beijing time. We really had that phone call. And following, that's real first G20 summit, November in Washington, D.C., chaired by President Bush and the Chinese president who joined that meeting. That's a very successful meeting and paved the way for next the G20 meeting in London to build up real firewall for IMF. $1 trillion be gathered through that meeting to really strong deal with the challenge of international financial crisis. That's real demonstrate how strong position of China-US cooperation, how positive impact of that cooperation to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Zhu. So that kind of cooperation in fighting the global financial crisis, I mean, we should really draw lessons on that. About 12 years ago, 30 years ago, that we can really using that spirit between China and US to fight the current pandemic as well. So you have provided very good examples of how we work together for the sake of the global prosperity. Now, my staff is telling me there's about 500,000 people watching us online currently in China and elsewhere globally, and so we had a very good discussion. I'd like to, in this second round of discussion, ask John to comment, because I know that you've been a professor at the Tsinghua University Economic and Management School for many years. You have taught a lot of Chinese students. You basically, serving as a honorary chair for both Brookings Institution for many years, over a decade, and also now a few years with Asian Society in the U.S. You travel frequently. I mean, there's an issue about student exchanges between China and U.S. Because I know that I heard from the Charters Fair of U.S. Embassy here that U.S. Embassy now is issuing 1,000 visa a day, and by the time of summer, they're going to issue 200,000 visas for students going to the United States. But but again, looking at the numbers, there's refusal rate as well. There's about 2 or 3% of refusal rate on that. So how do you think about this people-to-people exchange, business exchange, tourism, cultural exchange, and of course, think tank exchanges that really, during this special time, that we can really promote that on both sides, and how we can really leave this, work out this travel ban, because now, the virus is recognized by the WHO, but not recognized by US and China on each other, not recognized by EU and China. So, I mean, we probably have to live with virus for a long time, but then if we don't really have international currency of mobility, to government to work together, we may suffer that. I mean, already you are the expert on so many areas. So also on the other general comments, I'd like to hear you, John, again. Thanks.
Thank you. I can be succinct on this point. I think to state the obvious, the ties between the U.S. or the American people and the Chinese people, to me, are absolutely essential to getting the relationship where it needs to be. And I'm hopeful that the younger people who have a vested interest in the long-term future of their countries and the world will be forces for good in the relationship. In one way of thinking about China, for example, you think about the 400 million, roughly 400 million millennials, and how they have grown up and how they think about the future, and how the Chinese leadership has been and needs to be responsive to that group. And the same thing is true in the United States. That the ties between those groups are absolutely central to forward progress. And I'm pleased to see that the Biden administration, this is one area where they are moving quickly to rectify the previous policies of the policy of the previous administration to open back up again to people-to-people exchange. We all will know that the ties are deep, they're broad, they're state to state, they're universities to universities, they're NGOs to NGOs, they're individuals to individuals. I mean, it cannot be overstated that the sort of societal trust that needs to be built and was being built and can be built is probably the single best insurance policy against sort of untoward policies on the part of the leadership. I think in some ways, the wisdom or common sense of ordinary people can act as a kind of a brake against the occasional unwise policies of the elites. So I'll leave it at that.
Good. Okay, I think that we had a very good discussion, and we also, because we announced that our webinar that to the public, also we received some questions. I just want to maybe cite a few of them, and so we'll go last round of concluding remarks. Plus, if you could also address some of those questions that we collected beforehand from the Chinese media, actually. I have a question from China Daily. Basically, he said the U.S. administration made the rounds pushing for a leak hypothesis, while actually the virus could be happened not in just China but elsewhere. And should we pursue this at the same time as all the other sources, or just focusing on China? So this is just one question. And then China News Service also have a question that this year marks the 50th anniversary of Dr. Kissinger's visit to China. And also as the July 9 commemoration, Dr. Kissinger mentioned that the U.S.-China relationship is critical today than 1971. So is there any chance that two sides will somehow break the ice again 50 years later? And on the occasion of its 50th anniversary, what's your vision of the future development of China-U.S. relations? There's another question from Red Star News in China also. He said on July 28, which is just 2 days ago, that Qin Gang, the new Chinese ambassador to the United States, arrived in the United States and delivered a speech. He mentioned that 50 years ago, Dr. Kissinger visited China secretly and knocked on the doors of China. The door to Sino-US relation has been opened, and it will not be closed. What do you think about Qin Gang's remarks on that? And also the Beijing News also has a question. He said that on the eve of Chinese Lunar New Year, President Xi Jinping and also President Biden had a phone call, and also U.S. and China had high-level talks at Alaska, recently in Tianjin. And how would you comment on the future government-to-government exchanges between China and the U.S.? And so what about the prospect of President Xi and President Biden meeting at the G20 summit? What do you think about that? So those are the, a few questions we selected from the media that when we announced our webinar. So maybe we have our final rounds of concluding remarks, and maybe you can pick up the question you want to address. But also, any further thoughts on this balancing competition and cooperation? Because Secretary Blinken said it's competition, even fierce competition, cooperation, and confrontation. So, but we don't need a confrontation. What's your take? Maybe we'll start with Adam again as our goes this third round. Adam, please.
It's been such a rich discussion, and you gave me plenty of opportunity to speak, so I'm not sure I have much to add. All I would say is that as we're trying to balance competition and cooperation, the key point for both countries, or at least both economies, is to allow for some openness and allow the businesses and the people and the scholars to cooperate, even if the governments choose to compete. And we know from history, including the McCarthy era and the parts of the Cold War in the US, and obviously from very tragic periods under Mao, that when societies close down, they create their own corruption and their own abuse of power, as well as having obviously economic and human costs. So I think this is where the think tanks, to the extent that we are allowed to do so, have to be out there and reminding people that even if the top government officials in Washington and Beijing want to emphasize the competition, that usually gets distorted into abuses of power internally in those countries. And we should be calling people out on that.
Good. Ambassador Rowe?
I think the visit to Beijing by Dr. Kissinger 50 years ago is well worth commemorating, because it illustrates that when national interest is served by cooperation, differences in political and social systems does not have to block that cooperation. The problem with differences in systems, which has become a big issue in the United States in terms of thinking about China, is that at some level it does influence cooperation, but it shouldn't block it if it's in the national interest to cooperate. But the problem is illustrated by our ability to cooperate with Joseph Stalin when we were opposing Hitler. But when Hitler had been defeated, our ability to cooperate with the Soviet Union broke down. So in some ways, that's the type of issue we face with China. There are forces in the United States that want to block our cooperation with China because of the differences in our political systems. And we need to rethink about the Nixon-Kissinger opening to China at a time when there couldn't have been bigger differences between our domestic systems. China was in the height of the Cultural Revolution when that occurred. And yet we set that aside because of the importance of cooperating with China against the Soviet threat. And in my judgment, if we look at what the world requires and our responsibilities as great nations, it is clear to me that the lesson of the Kissinger visit to China is when it is necessary to cooperate, to have cooperation between China and the United States, we should not let the differences in our systems block that type of cooperation. And so I think it's a very important visit. Historically, it created the possibilities for the United States and China to create enormous common interests. And those common interests, in my judgment, continue, and we have to find ways to cooperate in promoting them.
Thank you, Ambassador Rowe. And so, Minister Chu, your concluding remarks.
Thank you. And today's situation and the relationship between China and the US is some different with that 50 years ago. One very key point is that both Chinese economy and the American economy is so closely connected. Not only every year more than 500 billion trade, also investment and global governance coordination. And however, we also face this new challenge. Both America and China with domestic public opinions up for some populism and some different voice. And this time, we really need the strong leadership by two presidents. I think that we must follow the sprint of President Xi, President Biden at the conversation at the eve of Chinese New Year. And just as Ambassador Roy said, we should expand our common ground and make our cooperation with more broadly expansion. And also, as Adam said, the two nations, social society, including the academic side and the people-to-people exchange, must be really enhanced to solid our people's base and to make our two great countries can more understand each other, can more cooperate together. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Zhu. And now we will have the final words for John. I know you've been really sit a long time, but I really appreciate your final comments as well.
Yeah, there's so much to say. I'll try to be very succinct. I was admiring the efforts on the part of Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and Elon Musk and others to go to space.
Yes.
And if you want to use one's imagination, being on these spaceships, looking down on the planet, when you're up there looking down, there's no difference between people living in China, people living in the United States, people living in Africa. And I think that we, A, need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and B, need to be more conscious of the fact that we live on one planet, and the issues are only going to get more complicated and more complex as we go forward, and that the leading countries, in this case, the two leading countries, the United States and China, which are the two leading countries now and will be for a very long time, they have a very big burden. The burden is they are responsible to lead the world to a safer, better place. And therefore, when we talk about competition and cooperation, I can understand and be comfortable with both those ideas between the countries. When we add this idea of confrontation, to me, that's absolutely out of the question. And we shouldn't even be considering that as a concept. The world simply can't take it. We shouldn't waste any time on it. As I said in my earlier comments, should the leading countries of the world really be spending their time arguing and or trying to do each other down, or should they be spending their time trying to get the world to a better place? To me, the answer is very obvious, and the sooner we recognize that, the better. And we're right to demand of our leaders that they get the big things right, as Nixon and Mao and Kissinger and Zhou Enlai did 50 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think that's an excellent energy that you talk about. All this recent space exploration and looking down from the Earth. We are really one. I mean, I remember the 2008 Beijing Olympic slogan was "One world, one dream." Basically, we are really one world. And this year Olympic in Tokyo, they actually enriched the motto that the Olympic has. It used to be faster, higher, stronger. Now this year they added the together. So I think we really, agreed that we are adding a new dimension. So I think tonight, the dialogue between the U.S. and China's think tanks at our 7th annual CCG conference was really a very vivid, a good example. I think you all had shared a very good light, has proposed a very good insights, recommendations, and suggestions. It's really great for the communication dialogue. We really appreciate that. So we had over 500,000 people listen to you live, and we want to go deep on that. We're going to digest that. We covered many ground from economic, social, international relations, geopolitics. I totally agree with what John just said at the last minute, that yes, we can compete. Let's have an Olympic peaceful competition. You know, but we have a lot of cooperation too. I mean, climate change, you know, minimum tax, and all the other issues that nuclear issues of North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan. I mean, now is another urgent issue now. So I think that the Tianjin high-level meeting has covered all this ground. They identified a number of areas to collaborate. Also, how we can revive the world by facilitate the movement of the people. You know, have a global vaccine passport or vaccine quickly spread that to the developing countries. All those issues, I think we covered that quite well. So I really appreciate all your time. Actually, you stayed quite a bit late for that already because we have so much a rich topic. I also look forward to continue our conversation like we did with Wilson Institute. In the past, we hope to do that with Peterson Institute and of course Asia Society, which I'm having another dialogue with Asia Society Vice President Wendy Cutler 2 days from now, and also Asia Society Hong Kong Chair Ronnie Chen on August the 1st. So we have a lot of exchange on that. On behalf of CCG, also on behalf of CCG advisor, Mr. Zhu, I want to thank Adam Posen, the president of Peterson Institute, Steve Roy, the founding director of the Kissinger Institute of Wilson Center, and of course, John Fountain, the honorary chair of Brookings, and also co-chair of Asia Society. Of course, my fellow counselor at the State Council, Minister Zhu Guangyao, and I also thank our audience for watching us live.